Proposed expenditure be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Fremantle.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I'm glad to be able to ask some questions about the environment portfolio. I guess there's a broad question that sits over the more specific queries, and the broad question is whether the Minister believes that it's the core responsibility of being in that role to stand up for and fight for the protection of Australia's environment and Australia's heritage, because what we seem to get instead is an approach of excusing or defending a number of areas of unacceptable environmental degradation and neglect, an approach that gaslights and directs opprobrium against Australians who care about and campaign for the health of our environment, and an approach that assumes somehow it's the job of the Environment Minister to consider first and foremost the needs of industry, when industry, I'm pretty sure, so coming from Western Australia, is quite confident in its ability to argue its own cause in a way that endangered species are not. And in any case, of course, industry has a number of ministers responsible for its specific issues. Shouldn't the Minister for the Environment be an unapologetic champion for the interests of the Australian environment, especially when you consider that our land and our sea has already endured very significant harm and is, in the words of the government's own appointed reviewer, on a trajectory of further decline? Deputy Speaker, it was only a year ago that the Juukan Gorge tragedy occurred, with the destruction by Rio Tinto of First Nations heritage of immeasurable value. And that fiasco had several components, including failures by this government, especially in its administration of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act. But what has occurred since that tragedy to make sure it never happens again? The government previously committed to reviewing the ATSIPA by December 2017. That didn't happen. That was 3.5 years ago. When is the government going to review and reform this critical and underperforming safety net for the protection of Indigenous cultural heritage of immeasurable value? Why isn't the government looking to include Graham Samuel's interim standards for national and world heritage protection in its reform of the EPBC? Is it really acceptable that the department's timetable for work on this issue after Juukan Gorge, with respect to heritage protection under the EPBC, only includes the following: for the first half of next year, and I quote, to continue engagement on modernisation of Indigenous cultural heritage protection, and then in the first half of the following year, all the way in 2023, to establish a pathway for implementing modernised Indigenous cultural heritage protections released. So after 3.5 years from the time they committed to the ATSIPA review and reform in the first place, we now have to wait another 2 years just to get to a pathway, all the while Indigenous cultural heritage is at risk. Deputy Speaker, it's only 2 weeks until the government's export ban on mixed plastics comes into force. There's understandable concern about what will actually happen to mixed plastic waste, because the government has failed to ensure we have sufficient infrastructure to recycle and reprocess the waste we'd previously sent to other countries. There's no question whatsoever that the government took way too long to come to Labor's position, which was that some direct investment was going to be required. The 2019 Recycling Investment Fund was a joke. It was a complete failure. Not a single dollar was advanced. The face-saving Recycling Modernisation Fund that followed on its heels has only advanced $4.5 million to date. It's created no additional plastic reprocessing capacity. There is now a real risk that beyond the 1st of July we will see mixed plastics sent to landfill or otherwise stockpiled, or need the benefit of an exemption so it can be exported, and which we know, in the case of stockpiling, we know that presents fire risks. The government received a report that pointed out the risk of this occurring wasn't low. Minister, what contingencies are in place to deal with this possibility, and can you guarantee that beyond the 1st of July mixed plastics will not be sent to landfill or dangerously stockpiled? Deputy Speaker, earlier this year the Minister listed the Australian sea lion as endangered under the EPBC. It's one of 283 listings of threatened or endangered species under this government, a coalition that kicked off by reducing Labor's network of marine protected areas by 50%, a coalition government whose failed threatened species strategy did not include any focus on marine species. Now we're told that might get corrected under the new strategy, which has just been delivered several months too late, but the new strategy doesn't have any details, doesn't have any actions, doesn't have any targets, and doesn't have any apparent new resources. Minister, in your speech to the Press Club, you accused your opponents, which presumably includes all Australians who rightly want to see proper protection of our environment, of being too focused on activism rather than outcomes. Isn't it the outcomes that are the problem? Isn't that why people are moved to activism? Minister, when are you as the Minister for the Environment, going to exercise that responsibility rather than being an apologist for a government that has presided over serious and steepening environmental decline?
Here.